More than 20 years have passed since those fateful events in the summer of 1996 in the Blackwood Forest in Northern California. But I can't get through a day without thinking about what happened to us there. Nightmares still awaken me at night, drenching my body with cold sweat. The screams of my friends and their lifeless bodies I still see in my dreams, even though it all happened in the days when I was only a teenager. That camping trip shaped the rest of my life that followed. In those summer days, we were just carefree schoolboys looking for adventure, too young and naive to realize what danger lurked in those deep woods. Blackwood had a sinister reputation. There were many stories and legends surrounding the 1,000-acre forest. The locals in the town of Redfield warned us about ghosts and told us about mystical creatures and unbelievable disappearances that had happened over the centuries. We just laughed at these stories, thinking the townspeople were posturing. We had no idea how horrible and real the evil and danger lurking in these woods were. My friends and I had been planning this hike for months, and now, after weeks of anticipation, the main weekend was upon us. We loaded all our gear into 2 SUVs and hit the road. We were ready for a fun outing into the deep woods. There were only 6 of us: me, my best friend Mark, our friends Jen and Ben, and our couple friends Callie and Ryan. We turned on some music during the ride, singing along and energizing ourselves before our big adventure. The long drive flew by quickly because we were laughing and joking the whole time. We drove off the main road onto increasingly narrow and winding dirt roads, and the further we got away from civilization, the more excited we became. Finally, we arrived at our destination, parking in a gravel lot by the trailhead. We shouted and applauded, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction at our journey into nature. As we exited the vehicles, I did a little celebratory dance, anticipating the start of the trail. We opened the back doors of the SUVs and began unloading all of our hiking gear. I put on my large hiking backpack and tightened the straps on my shoulders. The weight of a fully filled backpack brought a pleasant calmness, like I was ready for an epic adventure. My friends put on their hiking clothes and boots as well. We gathered all of our shared gear and distributed it evenly between us. Tents, cooking gear, food for dinner and breakfast, first aid kit, water filter, ropes, rain jackets, and other little things were all divided equally. I packed my portion into my backpack, trying to distribute the weight evenly. Ben asked if we had brought rain jackets in case of a thunderstorm after lunch. We all answered in the affirmative. Mark was like the big brother of our group, always looking out for us. I smiled as I looked around at my friends and appreciated what each of us brought to our team's strengths. Finally, fully equipped with backpacks, hiking poles in hand, and a trail map, we were ready. We did a final check, making sure our backpacks were securely buckled, and set out on the trail. Mark walked ahead at a brisk pace, and I followed right behind him. The others chatted animatedly as we plunged into the forest. A very thick green forest surrounded us on all sides. We were mostly going uphill, although the climb was moderate. Adrenaline was boiling in our veins, and we were going very fast. After about 45 minutes, Mark announced a short drinking break. We took off our backpacks and sipped some water. "How is everyone feeling?" he asked. "I'm feeling good," Jen replied. "My backpack feels great. It was worth it to take so long to get here." We all muttered our agreement and then continued upward. As we climbed higher, the forest around us became thicker and wilder. Huge pine trees stuck out restlessly above us, and a lush carpet of ferns and mosses covered the shaded forest floor. After several hours of walking, I began to feel my legs and thighs start to cramp. He grinned and checked the map and GPS unit. "Still a little under 2 miles, I'd say," he replied. "Great, we're quite on pace," I exclaimed excitedly, and we continued onward, the thought of dropping the heavy backpacks cheering us on. Half an hour later, we came across a picturesque stream, rushing noisily through the forest. The cool mountain water looked incredibly inviting. Mark checked our location once more. "Here we are," he announced triumphantly. Up ahead, gaps were showing between the trees. We advanced into the open space, marveling at the idyllic spot that would become our camp for the next few days. It was a cozy flat clearing, about the size of a half-acre, surrounded by tall pines that created a pleasant shade. "Perfect spot," Jen exclaimed. dropping her backpack to the ground with a clatter, and said to Rayan, "This is just an always home place, it's so worth coming here." We all showed our agreement and enthusiasm, gratefully taking the heavy backpacks off our shoulders. I stretched and twisted my neck and shoulders, feeling pleasantly relieved after a long journey with such a load. "All right, guys. Let's break camp before sunset," Mark ordered. Mark and I had done enough traveling together that setting up our shared tent had become a routine and cohesive process. Working together, we set it up and secured it in a flat spot. Meanwhile, Jen and Callie teamed up to put up their tent. Each couple set up their own tent. Soon, our cozy little camp was fully assembled. We stood around admiring our work. 3 cute tents were placed around a spacious area for a campfire. This backwoods campsite already seemed welcoming and inviting. Mark built a fire from logs and rocks, while the rest of us unfolded our sleeping mats and bags and laid them out neatly in our tents. By the time we finished setting up camp, the orange light of sunset was filtering through the trees. I took a deep breath of the fresh mountain air. "This is exactly what I need," I said to Mark in satisfaction. "Just wait until the fire is lit tonight," he replied with a smile. By then, my stomach was already making itself loudly known. "Who's ready to eat?" Mark asked. Everyone responded positively at once. We set up our folding chairs and coolers and organized a festive feast of hot dogs, chips, and cold beer by the creek at sunset. There's nothing like food that tastes better outdoors and after a good meal. We all sat contentedly watching the sparks from our campfire. As the day turned to night, we laughed and entertained each other with stories by the light of the blazing fire. Amazingly, I looked up at the brilliant sky above us. I really enjoyed this moment of disconnecting from everything and spending time with close friends. After a while, Mark decided to go into the woods to take a leak. Ryan teased him, cautioning caution because of the bears. We all laughed as Mark waved carelessly and disappeared into the darkness. 15 minutes passed, but Mark still hadn't returned. Jen jokingly asked, "Are you okay, Mark? You didn't get eaten by a mountain lion?" We all laughed, but inside I was starting to get anxious. It shouldn't take this long to just pee. After a while, Jen called out Mark's name again, but got only silence in response. Now I was starting to get seriously anxious. With Jen, we looked at each other, both of us thinking the same thing. We stood up and grabbed flashlights. "We should go and find him," I told the others. They agreed, looking concerned. Jen and I headed into the woods toward where Mark had left earlier. We yelled his name and shined flashlights around him. The search was terrifying, like a horror movie. The dark and dense forest absorbed the light of our flashlights just a few yards away. "Mark!" I shouted desperately. My heart was pounding. "Where is he?" After another 20 minutes of searching without success, we decided to turn back. No one wanted to say it out loud, but everyone was scared. Something was wrong. We hurried over to our friends by the fire. Callie jumped up, however Jen and I shook our heads grimly. We quickly explained that Mark was still gone. The carefree mood vanished. "I'll go look next," Ben suggested. One by one we grabbed our flashlights and set off into the dark woods, yelling his name over and over again. Each time one returned alone, the fear only increased. After 2 hours of fruitless searching in all directions, we gathered around the campfire again, exhausted and scared. Mark had disappeared without a trace. We wondered what was happening beyond our campfire, beyond our field of vision. We debated whether we should pack up and leave the place immediately, but we decided not to leave our friend behind, even though we were all terrified of the reason for his disappearance. In the end, we decided to spend the night here and at dawn to continue our search. None of us could sleep for a long time. We worried and boiled our imaginations. At one point, I thought I heard a distant scream from the dark forest. I woke up suddenly, holding my breath and straining my ears. Did I think I was just imagining it? Jen's frightened eyes confirmed that she had heard it in her tent too. We didn't talk about it out loud, but inside we each came to the same conclusion. Something sinister had happened here in this frightening forest. Mark wasn't just lost or hurt, he had been kidnapped. But by whom or what, we didn't know. However, We would not allow ourselves to leave until we found Mark, or at least found signs of him. With the first rays of dawn breaking through the trees, we gathered our gear and decided to find out the truth. We set off into the woods as a group, yelling Mark's name and jumping at every rustle of twigs or noise. "Where are you, Mark? What happened to you?" The endless trees offered no answers. After Mark's disappearance, we all slowly made our way back to the campfire. The blazing flames subsided into burning embers that reflected a menacing reddish light on our anxious faces. I stared into the dying fire, remembering over and over again the disturbing events of the evening. Mark had gone alone into the dark woods, the endless and hopeless search, his chilling disappearance. I took my eyes away from the fire and saw the frightened faces of my friends gathered around me. Jen clutched her knees to her chest and rocked quietly back and forth. Her usual liveliness was replaced by a tense and greedy look. Ben just stared blankly ahead, absent-mindedly poking at the fire with a long stick. Callie's face was streaked with tears and she clutched Ryan's hand tightly. She looked completely lost. The silence around the fire was inexorable. It was clear to everyone that the same terrible thoughts were plaguing us about what might have happened to Mark, and what lurked out there, beyond the fragile beachhead of the fire. Jen was the first to break the agonizing silence. "We need to get out of here. And now." Her voice shook as she made an insistent plea to the group. Callie lifted her head, her eyes glittering with anger and defiance. "No, we can't just leave Mark like that," she objected vehemently. Ryan put his hand on her shoulder reassuringly, but she recoiled. "Babe, Jen's right," Ryan said softly. "We've been looking all over for Mark. It's not safe for us to stay here." There was regret in his voice. Ryan was the most logical among us, despite how painful it was for him. It was clear that he no longer believed Mark could be alive. "So we'll just leave without him," Callie cried, new tears streaming down her cheeks. Ben finally spoke, his voice calm and subdued. "Mark probably—" He paused and took a shaky breath before continuing. "Look, it's unpleasant to say, but I think we have to accept that he might be dead." His straightforward words struck me like a punch to the gut. The devastating possibility spoken aloud somehow made it more real and confirmed my deepest fears. Beside me, Jen let out a subdued sob, cradling her hands in her own. There was a heavy silence, only broken by Callie's agonizing sobs. In the firelight, I could see Ben's eyes glistening with tears. Mark was one of his closest friends. We were all on edge, but we couldn't fall apart now. Unless we wanted to survive. Okay, let's just get together and deal with the situation," I said, trying to give my voice a calming power. "I think we can all agree that something sinister is going on here." Everyone nodded solemnly. "As much as it hurts, I think it's not safe for us to stay here," I continued softly. "But we also can't just disappear like Mark did. We have an obligation to come back with help." This started another anxious debate about whether we should flee the forest now or stay in camp until dawn. Callie was adamant about not leaving Mark in the lurch. As the argument continued, I felt myself hesitating, not knowing what decision to make. But one thing was clear. We needed to decide on our next steps as soon as possible, before whatever had taken Mark came for any of us. "Maybe we could just pack up and go to the nearest town for help," Jen suggested, hopeful. "We'd have to drive another hour or more on winding dirt roads to get to the nearest town, though." She glanced at each of us, hoping for support, but I doubted the idea would work. Who would we be able to find in a secluded village in the middle of the night? On the opposite side of the campfire, Ryan suddenly lifted up, and his eyes became sharp. "No, we're staying here," he said. We all turned around to look at him as he continued. "We can't let some weird noises scare us and ruin this trip. We came here to have a fun weekend of camping with friends. I suggest wait until dawn before making rash decisions." "Rash decisions," she exclaimed, fear reflected on her face. "Mark is gone, and who knows what happened to him, and you're suggesting we just stay here carelessly until morning?" Ryan held up his hands reassuringly. "Look, I know you're scared, and we all feel fear together. But it seems like what dragged Mark away is only targeting loners. If we stay together in camp, we'll be safe until dawn. Despite his soothing words, I felt a knot of fear twisting in my stomach. Mark had just gone to the bathroom only 100 yards from camp. Would we really be safe staying here with whatever was lurking in the woods? Jen expressed her fears. Tears seemed to well up in her eyes. Mark was taken so close to the camp, she said anxiously. What if that thing comes back for any of us? I'll stay awake all night and keep the fire going. All of you try to rest, he said. His jaw was clenched like a rock. I looked at Ben and Callie. Ben nodded silently and Callie squeezed Ryan's hand tightly as if she believed what he said. As for me, every cell in my body was screaming that we needed to get out of these woods right now. But Ryan and Callie seemed determined to stay. I glanced at Jen and Ben. We were outnumbered. Despite the internal cry of instinct to run, we reluctantly agreed to stay until dawn. The campfire that used to burn brightly was slowly dying down to a low flame and burning embers. We were almost out of wood. After we had spent the entire evening diligently feeding the fire, hoping its light would keep us safe, and watching the sparks fly off into the dark night sky. We need more firewood, he said. Me and Ben will go get them. Ben nodded silently and stood up. I watched as he attached a huge hunting knife to his belt and then grabbed one of the flashlights. Ryan grabbed the other flashlight and the two of them headed into the woods. The rest of us watched the beams of their flashlights disappear among the trees, leaving us in the ghostly light of the campfire. I felt a wave of fear and vulnerability when Ryan and Ben were no longer around. Jen clung to me and squeezed my hand tightly, trying to comfort me. Callie just sat openly wrapped in a blanket and stared blankly ahead. We were all exhausted from the emotional turmoil of the night, but too scared to sleep. To calm my nerves, I tried to make idle conversation while we waited. The stars are gorgeous tonight, I remarked, looking up at the twinkling expanse of sky above us. Jen nodded, but her answer sounded dry. Yeah, maybe. I chastised myself for making such a trivial conversation, given our current situation. The camp was once again unsettlingly silent. Every rustle in the forest made us flinch. About 20 minutes had passed when Jen interrupted the silence again. They had to come back, didn't they? Her voice shook with fear. I shook my head, not allowing myself to think of the consequences. Give them a little more time, I replied, trying to sound confident despite my growing fear. But as nearly an hour passed and Ryan and Ben were still nowhere to be seen, we couldn't ignore the horrible truth any longer. They were gone, just like Mark before them. Jen cried, holding back tears. God, we need to look for them. I took a deep breath, preparing myself. She was right. Taking flashlights and knives and clutching shaky handles, the three of us headed into the woods. Jen called out for Ben, and I yelled desperately for Ryan. But there was only emptiness in response to our calls. My heart raced as we walked, hugging flashlights, into the dark forest. We absolutely had to find Ryan and Ben. Rays of light shone through the darkness as we called their names over and over again. Jen walked a little ahead of me, and I could see her shoulders shaking. Though I was scared, I knew I had to be strong for them and for Callie. I hurried over to where she pointed the beam of light at the base of a large oak tree. Ryan and Ben's flashlights lay there, faintly illuminating the dark forest floor. But Ryan and Ben were nowhere to be seen. They had simply disappeared just like Mark before them. Callie let out a long sob and knelt down beside me. I stood, paralyzed, and through my sobs, I realized the horrible reality that surrounded us. The unseen evil lurking in this forest was taking us one by one. I helped Callie up and hugged Jen as she burst into tears. Although I wanted to faint from grief, I knew I had to get us out of here. Come on, we need to move, I urged and hugged them, heading away from this nightmarish place. They walked beside me, clinging to my sides for support and comfort. Finally, we made it out of the forest and into the clearing of our camp. Why? Why had this happened to us? She looked up at the sky, crying. The sight of her suffering brought me out of my daze. We had to act fast. I shook Callie. Callie, look at me. We're getting out of here, okay? Come on. Help us pack. We silently set off on foot down the dirt road, ready for the long journey. I tried to look determined, but my anxious heart gave away my worry. Were we in danger again? We walked in tense silence, feeling the tension. Every slightest sound from the dark forest made us shiver. We were realistically in a situation where 3 young women were fighting for their lives against an unknown evil. But did we have a choice? There was no stopping. Another hour went by and Jen suddenly stopped. "Do you guys think we can make it back on foot on our own?" Kelly, twisting her head nervously, replied, "Yeah. What if we just get lost walking in the dark? Maybe we should have just stayed where we were." I was beginning to doubt it. They were right. Wandering blindly through an unfamiliar forest at night was very risky, but just sitting there idly was even worse. "Let's walk some more," I said. I know it's possible to go back, but to be honest, I was beginning to doubt it. Are we even going in the right direction? In the dark, everything looked the same. We kept walking, but soon tired from stress and lack of sleep. Our stride became haggard and exhausting. After half an hour, finding no sign of the road, we stopped again, and Jen, head down in her hands, lost her strength. God, we were completely lost. She moaned. I sat down next to her, my feet aching in my boots. Nothing around us seemed familiar. Jen had been right. We really were lost. But I wasn't ready to give up yet. "Let's just rest for a minute to clear our heads and then we'll come up with a plan," I suggested, trying to sound determined. Kelly stood, wrapping her arms around her shoulders and taking in her surroundings with her gaze. "I don't like just sitting here. We're completely defenseless against everything." I knew she was right. Standing still was dangerous, but wandering blindly and getting lost in the dark was an even bigger risk. A grim shiver ran down my spine. I felt like someone was watching us. Something evil was coming. Jen felt it too. She rose anxiously. "You know what? Maybe we should go back to camp after all. I think we underestimated how hard it would be to walk in the dark." I stood up, feeling the pain in my legs. Unable to find a better option, we reluctantly decided to head back the way we had come. The way back seemed to take much longer and was full of frustration. The night pressed upon us with its oppressive influence. Shadows flickered in the corners of our eyes. The whole forest seemed hostile and predatory. Finally, when dawn was still far away, we saw the faint light of a campfire. We slowly walked back to the clearing, too tired to feel defeated. We roasted the fire as best we could and huddled together. The remaining hours until dawn passed agonizingly slowly. We took turns standing guard while the rest of us tried to rest. Every sound of a branch or rustle in the bushes made us jump up, and our weary minds imagined unseen threats lurking just over the horizon. When it was my turn to stand guard, I walked over to the dim fire, peering intensely into the darkness and clutching a thick wooden branch in my hand. Neither of us had been able to sleep for longer than a few minutes that night. Jen came out of the tent with a blanket draped over her shoulders, dark circles under her eyes. "How are you holding up?" I asked softly. "How do you think?" She answered sharply. I nodded in understanding. We were all on the verge of ruin. Jen looked at me anxiously. "We have to run to the cars while it's still dark. It's our only hope." I hesitated. As much as I wanted to escape this nightmare, I knew Kelly wouldn't let us leave the others behind. As if on cue, Kelly came out of the tent upon hearing us, and her expression turned rigid. "No way," she said unwaveringly. "We stick together no matter what." Jen wrung her hands in frustration. "Stick together and wait for us to be killed one by one like the rest of us don't give a damn? No way, I'm out of here." She started to gather her things to leave. Kaylee stormed in and grabbed Jen's arm roughly. "You're not going anywhere." Jen released her hand and grabbed Kaylee's face. "Don't tell me what to do. I'm trying to save myself since the others clearly don't care." They continued to yell at each other. I stepped in between them, keeping them away from each other until the argument turned into a fight. "Stop it!" I shouted. They backed off, still full of anger but regaining their senses. I felt bad about how quickly our group had fallen apart. We were at our limit, exhausted to the max. Later, while Kelly was on duty, her piercing screams woke me up. I jumped out of the tent. The silence of the night was broken by distant howls and heavy footsteps, the rustling of leaves growing louder and louder. The noise seemed to surround us from all sides and was inexorably approaching our camp. Callie sobbed, frozen with terror. Adrenaline boiled in my veins as we screamed in blind panic. Desperately, I tried to rekindle the dying embers, and Jen and Callie screamed, grabbing burning branches as weapons. We peered into the darkness beyond the faint ring of light from the campfire and discerned a large figure slowly circling the perimeter of the camp. It moved in an unnatural, cumbersome gait, looping between the trees and disappearing from view. My heart clenched with primal terror at the sight of this creature that stalked us. The ancient, savage part of my brain understood that it was an unmistakable threat closing in on us, though my mind couldn't realize or accept what was happening. Jen clutched hoarsely at my arm, panting. "We need to run." Before I could respond, Callie turned to Jen, eyes shining. "Are you out of your mind? We can't leave our friends behind," she shouted. Jen looked at her fiercely. "Do you really think Mark or anyone else is still alive? That creature is after us. We have to leave. I'm confused." "What are you talking about?" "Of course it's me," I whispered pleadingly, but I could already see enemies everywhere and my exhausted mind faltered. "Stay back," I shouted, grabbing a branch from the ground and waving it threateningly. "Hey, calm down," Callie said slowly, raising her hand. "You're not in your right mind right now. Just breathe." But her soothing words only reinforced my misconceptions that this was some kind of joke, trying to make me smug. Before she could get any closer, I lashed out and roughly knocked her to the ground. Callie fought back as I tried to hold her down. "It's me, you idiot, stop!" she screamed hoarsely, but her protests found no response. I was too far away. Now I was acting on primal instinct. We rolled uncontrollably across the forest floor, leaves and dirt flying from our struggle. Callie kicked me hard in the stomach with her knee, knocking the spirit out of me for a moment, but adrenaline wouldn't let me stop. I landed a punch to her jaw, making her cry out. Eventually, after hours of scuffling, we collapsed next to each other, exhausted and drenched in blood. My wild suspicions gradually waned as the manic fuse of energy dried up. I painfully rolled over onto my back and saw Callie lying nearby with swollen eyes and trembling limbs. A sudden realization swept over me. "Oh my God, Callie, it's really you." I stuttered, scared of myself. "I'm so sorry. I don't know what's happening to me." She looked back at me warily. "It's time for you to come to your senses," she wheezed. I crawled over to her to help her stand up. She flinched, but let me examine her wounds. "At least there are no broken bones," I sighed in relief. Leaning on each other, we limped back to our camp. Callie and I sat in silence, clutching the hunting knife we had behind each other. Neither of us had time for real rest. Whenever it was my turn to stand guard, I stood nervously, worried, on a log by the extinguished fire. The knife was ready, and my eyes scanned the approaching forest for any sign of movement. Callie couldn't sleep either. I could hear her fidgeting in the tent, shrieking from vivid nightmares. As the hour of dawn came, the noise around our camp grew to a frenzy. Branches creaked, leaves rustled, and strange howls sounded in the distance, making me nervous. It seemed as if a sinister presence lurking outside was deliberately taunting us, making us psychologically tormented before proceeding with the kill. The chaotic sounds created an eerie oral accompaniment to our suffering, keeping us in a constant state of fear. At one point, I realized with horror that the fire had completely died down, leaving us in complete darkness. However, fear made my hands numb and useless. Soon, a crushing blanket of darkness enveloped us, as if it were a physical manifestation of the evil that had destroyed our group. When I heard Callie begin to move again in her tent, I gently called out to her. "Callie, are you awake?" The campfire had gone out. She slowly crawled out of the tent, throwing a blanket over her shoulders. Even in the darkness, I saw the blank, frightened look in her eyes. This night has broken us both. "What are we going to do?" She muttered in a voice rough from screaming. I only shook my head helplessly, completely confused. We stood like that while the night sounds increased, trying to stir up the dead fire one by one, and the unseen predatory creatures seemed to be getting closer. Finally, I resolutely grabbed the knife from Callie. "Try to start the fire," I said with a new, determined tone. "I'll stand guard." She nodded dazedly and continued mashing the flint. I widened my stance, holding the knife in front of me with trembling hands. My heart pounded frantically as the sounds grew louder and closer, the cracking of twigs, heavy footsteps, guttural grunts. In one moment of panic, I suddenly felt Callie desperately grabbing for the knife. "Give it to me," she screamed. We struggled for a while, waving our arms around blindly. Then I felt the knife digging into the soft fabric. Callie cried out in agony, and the sound struck my soul. My flashlight revealed all the horrors. The knife was lodged in Callie's right forearm, blood dripping down her fingers as she clutched the wound. "No, no, no," I stammered, lunging to help. But she forcefully pushed me away with her healthy hand. She staggered away from me into the darkness of the trees, leaving a trail of black blood glistening on the leaves. I was alone now, and there was no one else besides me who could do anything to counter the evil that was systematically destroying us. But as the sounds grew closer, I sank to my knees in utter alarm and despair, the knife falling uselessly from my hand, spasmodically trying to strike the flint again to revive the fire, but my hands were numb and useless with fear. The absolute darkness surrounding me seemed alive and insatiable. After several unsuccessful attempts to rekindle the fire, I finally resigned myself to my fate. There would be no fire or light to ward off the horrors that lurked beyond the faint circle of the camp. Not knowing what to do in these last hours, I sat down on the cold, muddy ground, and with trembling hands pulled my cell phone from my pocket. I knew that with the arrival of a new day, I would not be able to make it out of this forest alive. The least I could do was record a goodbye message to my family, a sort of explanation in case they never found my body. With tears in my eyes, I proceeded to record an incoherent video. "Mom, Dad, it's me. I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have come here. It was a mistake." I wiped my eyes, pausing frequently to gather my thoughts, and recounted the horrible events of that night. I told them how much I loved them, and how I wished I could appreciate our time together more instead of taking it for granted. Finally, I told them everything I thought and wrote it down. I wondered gloomily if anyone would ever see this letter, or if it would be buried in the woods forever. If it was no consolation, at least I had reformed. Staggering, I put my cell phone back in my pocket and looked up. In the darkness of the night, signs of dawn were just beginning to appear. Sitting up, I considered the few remaining options and decided that I couldn't just passively wait for dawn. If I was destined to die anyway, I would at least fight with my last strength. Suddenly, I remembered the gravel parking lot where I had first left my car. It seemed like a long time ago. If I could somehow manage to get back there, I could escape this nightmare. It was a faint hope, but it was the only hope I had left. As soon as the pale light of dawn broke through the trees, I rushed into action. I ran out of the woods and ran frantically in the direction where the parking lot was supposed to be. My feet were hot and my lungs demanded air, but I overcame the pain and ran faster than I had ever run in my life. Ahead, the gravel parking lot appeared out of the shadows of the trees. The car still stood there, untouched. They seemed to be beckoning me to run. Gathering the last of my strength, I rushed recklessly. Safety was just around the corner, but I was only a few meters away from freedom. I was blinded and thrown to the ground under such weight. The impact knocked the air from my lungs and I fell face first into the dirt. I gasped and weakly beat the ground with my claws, but what engulfed me was stronger. This was it. Paralyzed with fear, the man had no choice but to lie helplessly beneath the monster. I felt its sharp breath on my neck. I flinched as I felt its sharp teeth scratching my skin. I closed my eyes and tensed, praying this would end soon. I could hear the excited growling in my ears as the creature played with me, as if enjoying my fear and pain. This is it, I thought. This is how I'm going to die. The creature's huge clawed hands gripped my ankles in a vice. Before I could react, The creature yanked me off the ground and dragged me away, slamming my body painfully against rocks and tree roots. I kicked and screamed furiously, but it was like hitting a wall of rubble. As if ignoring my blows, the monster dragged me like a rag doll deeper and deeper into the shadowy forest. I wriggled frantically, claws digging into the ground and fingers digging into the undergrowth. Behind me, a deep crevice had formed in the forest floor, but thick, tangled roots slowed my progress slightly and kept me from breaking free. The creature paid no attention to my attempts and remained focused on its goal. The creature dragged me forward. As we went deeper into the dense forest, the morning sunlight faded. Soon darkness enveloped us, the trees obscuring the sky overhead. Any fleeting hope of escape soon vanished completely, replaced by a vague sense of dread. The parking lot and my friends now seemed part of another life. No rescue, no escape from the harsh fate that awaited me. After being dragged through the woods for what seemed like an eternity, I finally came to a small rock ledge. An old, crumbling hut loomed before me. The sight of this ghastly structure made my blood run cold. My primitive instincts told me that this hut held a horror beyond description. The creature dragged me up the creaky porch steps. I clung desperately to the weather-beaten boards, leaving claw marks in the wood, but they did nothing. The front door creaked open, barely hanging on its rusty hinges. It was as if the inner darkness stared malevolently outward. The creature leaned over and grabbed my arm. I resisted in vain like a caught fish and was dragged inside without difficulty. We descended a narrow staircase into the basement. In the cramped space, the smell of earth and rot came over me. The monster unceremoniously let go of me and I collapsed to the dirty floor. I realized with terrible certainty that I was not going to get out of here alive. The monster gave a chilling roar of victory and slammed the mangled wooden door shut, blocking out the last of the sunlight. I was thrown to the damp, dirty floor of the basement, breathless and horrified as I stared at the nightmarish scene before me. The dark basement was lit only by a narrow beam of sunlight shining through a small, soot-covered window in the ceiling. But even that was enough to realize the horror that surrounded me. All around me lay the corpses of my friends. Their eyes were empty and lifeless. Dark scarlet stains covered the dirt floor and splattered the stone walls. The strong copper odor of blood filled the small space, making my stomach churn and bile rise in my throat. Flesh had been stripped from some of the bodies and bones partially nibbled off. I swallowed and froze, staring at Ryan's mangled corpse. Only ribbons of torn flesh remained on his torso, and his exposed ribs had been ripped out at the base. This attic was the creature's lair, and the severed limbs and nibbled bones were the only remains of my friends. Horror gripped me, and a strangled sob escaped my lips. But the worst was yet to come. A deep growl echoed through the basement. As I turned away from the carnage, I saw the huge creature that had caused it towering over me. My mind went blank. I could not realize what kind of monster it was. It was at least 8 feet tall, with a powerful build and muscles beneath the shaggy fur. The distorted wolf's head was almost touching the low ceiling. The elongated muzzle, framed by jagged fangs, was covered in piles of fur and dried blood. Deep eyes, devoid of human intelligence, stared at me without mercy. I pressed myself against the blood-spattered stone wall in disbelief and fear. This was no ordinary animal, but something unnatural, something evil. The creature opened its mouth wide, saliva dripping from it. A piercing howl erupted from its throat and spread throughout the enclosed space. Its blood-curdling scream shook me to the core and dispelled any vain hopes that the monster would show mercy. Paralyzed with fear, I could only watch as the monster raised its huge clawed hands and tried to kill me and my friends. At that moment, a deafening gunshot rang out in the narrow basement. The creature recoiled with a ferocious, agonizing snarl and clawed at my shoulder, black blood gushing from the wound. As it came to its senses, a second shot rang out. The beast roared and turned around to meet the new threat. A powerful blow shattered the basement door, and a uniformed man with a pistol entered the basement. The ranger fired another shot, and the creature retreated into the darkest corner, continuing to roar furiously like a caged animal. As the gunfire continued, and the wounded beast retreated helplessly, my fear finally began to dissipate, and was replaced by exhausted relief. The monster roared furiously and bared its jagged fangs. But the Rangers didn't hesitate to fire again, and the deafening shots echoed painfully in the confined space. The creature flinched at the impact, but continued to stare fiercely at the armored man who had invaded its nest. "Back the hell off," shouted the Ranger, loading another round into the chamber. The Ranger reluctantly pushed the beast back against the wall. The beast looked for a way out. Its muscles tensed, but the Ranger blocked the only way out. With one last furious roar, the wounded monster turned and scrambled up the wooden steps on all fours. The Ranger fired after it, moving cautiously to see if the monster had escaped. There was an eerie silence in the cabin upstairs. Pulling out his pistols, the huntsman turned his attention to me. I was still paralyzed, kneeling against the blood-spattered stone wall. He slowly approached me, raising his hands. "It's okay. It's okay. It's okay. It's okay. I'm going to help you." When I didn't say anything, he gently took my hand. "Hey, look at me. I'm not hurt anywhere." I finally met his concerned gaze. I tried to speak, but all I managed was a strangled shudder. My vocal cords felt like they were frozen with fear. Seeing that I was too stunned to react, the Ranger quickly examined me for wounds and immediately radioed for help. "Need immediate medical attention, multiple casualties, serious injuries." I stayed pressed against the basement wall while he told me the details. But the bodies scattered around me told me that not everyone was so lucky. When the Ranger finished speaking, he turned to me again. I couldn't answer, and he sat next to me, still and silent, until the distant sound of a helicopter echoed through the forest. Hours later, in a daze, I was carried out of the damn cabin and taken to the nearest hospital. The doctors examined me from head to toe, and I was surprisingly unharmed, at least physically. Mentally and emotionally, however, things were different. I learned that most of the mutilated bodies of my friends, with the exception of Jen, had been found in the monster's hideout. When I was airlifted out, the search was still going on. As horrible as it was, I hoped that her remains would be found and her family could finally rest in peace. Over 30 years have passed since that hike, but not a day goes by that I don't think of that moment. 30 years have passed since then, and to this day, I have nightmares. I wake up at night in a cold sweat. When I close my eyes, I can still hear the screams and see the pale, lifeless bodies. Even after all this time, the horror of that weekend haunts me endlessly. My therapist keeps asking me to make peace with the past, to stop letting the past dictate the present. But how do I reconcile with what I've experienced? The fact that I woke up in that forest defies all reason and common sense. Of course, most people don't believe my story. They think I'm a delusional victim looking for attention. But I know the truth. The obituaries and news reports say it was a tragic animal attack, an accident. The authorities keep saying the case is closed. Sometimes I'm tempted to forget about it, to bury the memories and try to live something resembling a normal life. But I have an obligation to keep looking for answers for Mark, Jen, Ryan, and others, and to expose the evil that stole their lives and futures. Their families need closure and truth, as hard as it is to believe. Doctors keep prescribing me new cocktails of medication, as if these drugs will cure my broken spirit. My mom wants me to take pills to ease the pain, but I can't. The crowds and noise are too kind to my frayed nerves. I will never set foot in a pristine forest again. Only nature gives me peace. However, the quiet of the parks helps calm my nerves. At night, I sit outside and think that one day the nightmares will stop, and I will be able to remember my friends without remembering the horror of their deaths. I realize now that I never truly appreciated that simple friendship until it took them away forever. We take so much for granted and never know what jewel will be taken from us next. I would give anything to keep the laughter and light we shared before the darkness consumes us. But as desperately as I wish it, time only moves forward. I often think of that creature that escaped from the cabin. I wonder if it still roams the woods looking for new prey. Sometimes I think I see its shadow out of the corner of my eye. When I see a stranger in town, I am suddenly aware of its presence. Part of me wishes the gamekeepers had finished him off that day so that no more innocent lives would suffer. But another part of me knows that there are forces at work in this ancient forest that are beyond human comprehension. Forces that existed long before us and will exist long after we are gone. We awaken things that are better left untouched. I may never fully heal or rid myself of the memories that haunt me. I owe it to myself, and to those I couldn't save. Perhaps one day I will find a way to live with the ghosts. In the meantime, we can live one day at a time and be grateful for the little light that shines through the darkness. That's all we can do. I'll warn you right away that my horror stories involve food poisoning, so you probably shouldn't read them while eating. A few years ago, I loaded a bunch of camping gear on my bike and spent most of the next 7 months riding 300 miles, 8,500 kilometers, across most of the United States. Along the way, I mostly chose wilderness campsites. These are places where people are unlikely to find me, and where they wouldn't even care that I was there. And I did this entire trip alone. It was mid-November in southern Washington state. It was a normal day, nothing out of the ordinary, just bicycling all day. But after lunch, I started to get a bit of a stomach ache. Not bad enough to slow me down, but it was noticeable. Despite this, we decided to wild camp for the night. As dusk fell, we had no trouble finding a place to camp. I pitched my tent and went to bed, and before sunset I wrote in my journal and brushed my teeth. But pedaling an 80 Labessiere 36 Xler bike and hiking gear every day is hungry work. By my calculations, I was eating about 4,000 calories a day and losing a few pounds. So that evening, as I was doing my evening chores, I was a little concerned that I didn't have an appetite for a snack. As soon as I turned off the light and lay down, the upset stomach went away. I was so nauseous that I sat up in bed with my hand on the zipper of the tent door and tried to induce vomiting by opening the door and looking outside. However, after sitting for a long time, the nausea passed and he lay down again. A few minutes later, he felt sick again. Finally, around 11:30 that night, I threw up. I drank water from one of the 2 bottles to rinse my mouth of the vomit, drank more water to replenish the lost fluids, and lay down again. I felt much better and was able to get some sleep. However, I only slept for about 2 hours and then woke up again with nausea. Feeling terrible, I went back inside. I got up ready to vomit, but the feeling went away and came back again, and I ended up throwing up a second time at about 2:30 a.m. I rinsed my mouth out, drank some water, and went back to bed. I then woke up again at 4:30 a.m. Luckily, I didn't throw up the third time, but I knew I wouldn't be able to get back to sleep before sunrise. So I devised a new plan while I waited for sunrise a few hours later. I felt awful and didn't want to get back on the bike, but I knew I couldn't just sit idle. I needed to get back to civilization before my condition worsened. In addition, I ran out of water overnight. Fortunately, there was a town about 30 miles, 50 kilometers away, which was pretty easy for my good health. There was an inexpensive motel in town, and I decided to head there as soon as night fell, get a motel room, and get a good night's rest before feeling better. But just as it was getting light enough outside, and I was about to head out, the quiet sound of rain hitting the tent reached me. I checked the weather forecast on my cell phone and didn't expect it to rain for long, but as it turned out, it stopped after 20 minutes. I left my bag outside, took down the tent, and loaded all my stuff on my bike. I rolled the bike up to the road and sat on it, and then I felt something strange. As soon as I got off the bike, I immediately noticed a puncture. I was lucky, but I had the tools, parts, and knowledge to fix it, so I set to work. I wasn't in the best of spirits, and the tire repair took longer than it should have, and by the time the bike was running again, it was raining again. At this point, I had no choice but to put on my jacket, turn on my headlight, and ride on. Even though it was only 8 a.m., today was the worst day of the 100 or so rides I'd done up to that point. It was truly awful. Every turn of the pedals required incredible effort. I was cold and wet. I was exhausted on all fronts. I hadn't slept well. I was mentally exhausted, and physically, every muscle in my body ached. I was hungry, but I didn't want to cram too much food into my still upset stomach. In addition, I had run out of water the night before and was dehydrated. When had I ever experienced such an overpowering sense of hopelessness, whether on the road or at home? But eventually I made it to town and stopped at a grocery store to buy some food that would be easy on my stomach. I headed for the motel. I arrived an hour or two before check-in, but apparently I looked miserable too, and the receptionist let me into the room early. After a long shower and a phone call to my mom, I slept for 13 hours. When I woke up the next morning, I was feeling better. It was 100 kilometers, or 60 miles, to the big city I had always wanted to visit. It was quite a long day, even when I was in good physical shape, but the distance flew by quickly, and I arrived at the place by evening. However, the next day while at the museum, I contracted food poisoning. The next day was a rest day, and I stayed in a run-down hostel all day. I know it was nothing serious, and that's how I got it all out of my system. And the next day I felt better again. Looking back, I'm grateful that the diarrhea waited until I was back in civilized society. In a nutshell, I biked across the country, got food poisoning, my bike broke down, and I had to ride in the cold rain. 10. I still advise people to go camping by bike. When I was in college, I hiked and hunted with friends on the island, where my family home is located. The island borders the ship channel on the Louisiana coast and is about 5 miles from the Gulf of Mexico. This is a relatively new spot, but I had scouted it before. When we arrived at the site, we had to drag the boat 60 yards across the sandy bottom in a 4-minute walk to get close to the shoreline. We then buried a large 4-sided aluminum rod in the sand as far as we could, attaching a bow rope to it. With the boat tied up and my girlfriend happy, we crossed a sandy clearing in the hills next to a small cliff. The first problem was the lack of mosquito coils. Nevertheless, we packed up and headed into a wooded area. We found a spot, sat down, and started hunting. We saw nothing but mosquitoes and watched a very beautiful sunset. Naratha, this is where it all went wrong. I didn't have a lantern, and on the way back I went into a thick forest and pigs started roaming around. I could hear the pigs squealing, but I couldn't see them. I only had an AR laser, which didn't help with visibility at all. She saw the pigs scattering and panicked. We slowly made our way forward, got out, and quickly made our way back to camp to start a fire. We had to drive the wild cattle away, and one of our tent poles was broken. We built a fire, ate, and felt a little better. Then I went to bed. I tossed and turned. The temperature was about 60 degrees, but the humidity and fog were so thick that water was dripping from the tent roof. Drenched and freezing, we were just trying to survive. We awoke to the sound of a hurricane. The waves were crashing ridiculously loud. I thought it was a perfect clue. There was no laser light from the AR, and we ran through the fog, relying on the dim light of the moon. A large LNG vessel was coming down the channel and slammed into the shallow water with a whirlwind and a rumble, taking out trees and raising a wall of water. It's pretty violent, and I'm watching it. I lost my boat. I completely panicked. I started firing my laser, hoping I'd hit something. After about a minute, I hit the registration plate of a boat that was glowing in the reflection. It was Chanel's boat. I dropped my pants and gun and started swimming down the night passage. I reached the boat, whose bow rope was tangled in the trees and half sunk. Eventually, I got the boat up and swam about 5 meters out to sea. As soon as it was light enough, we packed up the tent and set sail. It was the worst camping night of my life. Thank you very much for watching.